Since the dawn of humanity, it's been our goal to make more people and create replicas of our best bits and remove the bits that we didn't like, and so most of the species got to procreating. But for the rest of us virgins, we had to settle for something else, and so we started to make fighting games. Unfortunately for us, we still had the same problem. We wanted more of the bits that we liked, but there's only so much time in the day, and we demand more content, so how do we get more characters to play with within the same amount of development time? Excellent. However, people quickly caught on to what developers were doing and a divide formed between the public. Some people really hated clone characters and some of them loved them. The camp that didn't like clones saw them as lazy padding to a system instead of more tangible content, but the camp on the other side liked the fact that there was a character that was the same but with a different name and look, giving them attachment to that character even though it was mostly superficial. Over time, developers started to want to shift the perspective that clones were carbon copies, and so they started making changes in minor ways to make characters feel different. Probably the clearest example of this is Ken and Ryu and the changes that they made to Tatsu, in which Ryu's knocks down and Ken's doesn't. The intended goal here isn't exactly clear, but this is the point where I'd say there was a clear intention where they wanted to distinguish clone characters as similar but not the same. Fast forward to the year 2020 and clones are few and far between in modern fighting games. Not only are clones near enough extinct, but the word hardly holds its original meaning. Hold on. Whilst Tekken 7 does have literal clone characters for some reason, King and Armor King are two entirely different characters, but upon first glance it might seem like Bamco are trying to pull up Bethesda. On paper they're incredibly similar characters. Hell, in Tekken 3 they were the same character. Thing is that once you get down to it, they're entirely different. Like, for example, I like playing Armor King, but playing regular King makes me so angry that I can see why women aren't attracted to me. Let's not even take a particular button into account. Let's just talk about the way that these two move. Armor King is a character that clearly wants to play around movement and forcing mistakes out of your opponent. King wants to play more in your opponent's face and force mix-ups. If you want to boil it down to the point where you're not being accurate anymore, Armor King wants to play footsies and King wants to play set play. In order to achieve this through movement alone, both characters were given crouch dashes, but one is able to fluidly cancel the crouch dash into itself to make very ambiguous approaches. The other is given a cancel that's bizarre and hard to use, so whilst it is technically possible, it's not something to be relied upon. This encourages Armor Kings to use this the same way that a Mishima would, in faking approaches and daring your opponent to press, but it encourages King to use it to set up throws and use it for mix-ups. This idea of the same tools but different concepts is then compounded by their buttons. Take both characters down forward ones, for example. Both characters have the same properties on block, although King's will occasionally just give +1 because it's Tekken 7, but King's is slower and gives less advantage on hit. Due to the faster startup, Armor King's allows him to move safely around his opponent and put them in cycling situations with down forward 1, and doesn't allow most characters to get big moves out to punish him for his pestering. This helps him to encourage his opponent to make a risk and punish them for trying to escape, building into the motif of being a character around forcing mistakes. For King, this means that it's a move that's still commanding, but he has to make a more committal choice after it. After all, now he's in more risk if he wants to repeat the situation, since it could lead to massive damage coming King's way. However, to compensate, they gave him a 2 extension, which allows him to push advantage and surprise the opponent to make it harder for them to tell when it's their turn, making them play extra defensive and allow King to start pushing for his throw game. Armor King has multi-throws like King, in which you put your opponent in a new guessing game after the initial throw, but the amount of damage and reward that you get isn't significant enough to be relied upon, unlike regular King, who is built specifically around doing stuff on knockdown and grabs. Because of this, King will want to work their opponent to a point where they can start forcing 50-50s, but Armor King will want to start forcing the opponent to make big guesses to try and escape pressure. They can also condition players to duck in entirely different ways, like King will naturally pressure his opponents into ducking because of his throw game, and so how much he does and doesn't show this tool will influence the amount that your opponent wants to stand. Armor King could theoretically do this too, but he also has tools that achieve the same thing but put him in a better position for his game. Tools like Crouch Dash 1 gives incredible plus frames on block, pushes them back, and starts making them need to make a risk to get out of the situation, which helps to control space and give the opponent more reason to attempt to contest the situation. But these are two characters that share similar moves but moved in entirely different directions in terms of gameplay. In reality, they're probably so far apart that Marduk is closer to King than Armor King is in terms of the character ideals. They're related in name and aesthetic alone, but what about someone who takes the ideas of the character that they're cloning and pushes them to the next level? You think I'm gonna go a whole video without talking about Gear? You're fucking crazy! Gear is probably a game you're already familiar with when it comes to turning up the speakers to 11 on its characters, and plus R did it twice with the same character. You've got Soul Bad Guy that's a bit more well-rounded but has the main goal of applying pressure to create wild throw mix-ups. And then there's Order Soul, who's built around mix-ups and applying pressure much like Soul Bad Guy, but sacrifices almost any defensive game to make it so that he has a more explosive offense. Order Soul might have effectively no anti-air, but he has a meter that powers up all of his aggressive specials, which gives him more damage and new combo potential. To truly see just how powerful this is, we should probably take 2 moves that are the same but are entirely different. An oxymoron that I'm sure you're sick of by now, but by the end of the video you'll want to strangle the life out of it. Soul Bad Guy's Gunflame, or 236p if you want to be a fucking nerd about it, is a ground-based projectile that puts your opponent at -3, and so is mostly intended to be RC'd behind to create mix-up potential. Autosol's Blockhead Buster is a combo move at level 1, allowing you to get a mini combo and creates knockdowns to get to level 2. It's also -2, but without it being an active hitbox, it's not able to cover you the same way that a Gunflame can, since there's no active hitbox after an RC. However, at level 2 it's plus on block. How plus, you ask? Well, here's a scale. Place your finger where you think it's gonna go. Got your finger there? Good. You were all wrong. It's plus 11. This gives you an absurd amount of freedom in your coming mix-up, and if you really want to be fucking crazy, you can RC it and it gives you plus 14. This also goes up to level 3, which gives you the unreasonably large plus 37? This is so much frame advantage that it's so far beyond overkill that you could probably go and make a whole new character by the time that you come out of block stun. But can you see how the characters that, even though they have the same goal, approach it in very different ways? Soul Bad Guy and Autosol both have these tools with the intention of being used for mix-ups, but one of them is given it through safety and option coverage, and one of them is just given it through raw statistics alone. Not to sound like a moron, but that gives the clone character their own character, and that's without taking into account the power of subtraction. By removing some of the more safe options in Autosol's neutral, you take away his ability to play passive and responsive with the same level of reliability as his counterpart. In doing so, you're encouraging the player to make different types of choices. For an Autosol, positioning yourself correctly is more down to placing yourself somewhere where you can avoid dangerous attacks that are coming your way, but also be ready to respond, or at least encourage your opponent towards the corner. For regular Soul, positioning is about trying to be close to your opponent, but also be planted in a position where you can safely get a Gunflame to follow behind or play passive to find an opening. That's not to say that regular Soul can't position himself like Autosol, but Autosol trying to position himself like regular Soul is like trying to fit circles into square holes, which is a habit that some of us clearly never got out of. However, some people might not assume that these characters are similar at all past character select, since Autosol was given his own separately animated sprites to assist with his new uniqueness. But when the line is blurred even further by sharing assets, you're inevitably going to have people not understand that these characters are very extremely different. Like, for example, okay, we've already talked about you. You're actually very different, and I don't really play your game. Okay, you'll do. Whilst both of these characters have lasers, share the same animations, both have the best move in the game, and are both furry bait, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who actually plays any of the Smash titles that say they'd be even remotely similar. That said, they're both characters that want to press advantage, force mistakes out of your opponent, and be active decision makers instead of passive reaction based characters, but they achieve the same things in different ways. Let's look at their projectiles as a clear sign of this, because I'm a sucker for fighting at distances that I can't get hurt. Falco's laser comes out slower but applies hit stun, whereas Fox's laser comes out much faster but doesn't apply any hit stun. This fundamentally changes how the characters are played. For Falco, it means that your lasers are more like a fireball, where you use it to force someone out of position or keep them locked in place if they're not willing to move out of the fucking way. For Fox, this tool is something to prod at the opponent and say, hey, your HP is getting real low, you better start approaching me soon or you're gonna die. Both of these tools force your opponent to make choices, but they're entirely different from the perspective of the aggressor and the defender. Many low-level players don't really care about Fox's laser and is kind of a non-thought for them because it doesn't literally take control away from the player. It has strategic cutoffs, but many low-level players probably won't end up seeing that because they're not thinking far enough ahead into the game. Contrast this with Falco's laser, where the lower you go, the more annoying the laser is to people because it forces control away from them, dictates the game's tempo, and cuts off options that they're probably tunnel visioned into, like controlling the bottom stage or making committal advances. Fox and Falco actually have changes all over the place. Melee in general is a game that's actually full of clones. Pichu Pikachu, Mario Doc, Ganon Falcon, Link Young Link, Roy Marth. I'll move on because there's loads of videos out there that cover this topic in more finesse, and quite frankly, looking at this game makes me feel sick. Moving on. Killer Instinct has 2 sets of clones. They're probably different. I don't know, I don't play this game. The point is, clones aren't clones anymore. They've changed so much that the word doesn't really mean anything anymore. Clones are characters that merely wear the influence of another character in the cast, but push the boat out on ideas that they were too afraid to take further, like some kind of bizarre tribute act that's somehow better than the original artist. But there's a point that I made at the start of the video which I think we might have overlooked, that it frees up developers to make more characters within less time. When you can borrow more assets from one part of a game and implement it into new content, it allows developers to access more of their ideas without having to give in to entropy, because now they can make more content with the same amount of time. But does it really? I asked Good News, who's the creative producer on the eventually to be released Cerebrawl, who told me something that I failed to consider. Whilst it does save time, it kind of depends on the game that you're making. With 3D, you've got a bit more flexibility in that you have a model that you can rig to the same animations to skip out on the enormous workload of having to draw frame by frame. 3D is also easier to make alterations to, since models can move along a calculated path dynamically, but in 2D you have to alter every frame individually. That's not to say that it isn't possible to save time within the second dimension. I mean, let's compare Fuqua to Philia in Skullgirls. Clones, however, they're entirely different characters, literally nothing alike. But some of these animations are carbon copies, which helps to alleviate the absurd amount of time that you'd have to spend animating characters in 60 FPS with hand-drawn sprites. What are you fucking animals? Why do you do this to yourself? And they also take some liberties with other moves, taking frames from one move and incorporating it into a new one to save out on time from scratching at paper like some kind of scratch card addict. They pointed out how in Street Fighter Super Turbo there were likely simple alterations to Ken's sprites which likely did save them a significant amount of time. Any new moves would have had to been drawn individually of course, but saving time not having to draw more unique frames for their normals helps to cut time down significantly. However, if we look at Soul and Order Soul, the differences are so significant that even if they used each sprite from Soul as a base, it'd still be a massive undertaking to change so much, even if it did save time. Clone characters only really started to receive their own unique animations for the same moves in Street Fighter once they entered the third dimension, and even then it took until 5 to do it. But the fact that they took so long to make this kind of leap in character clearly shows that they hold these characters as clones as an intentional and important decision, which made me reconsider the value that clones get. They're characters with unique ideas and new perspectives on what we already enjoy, but to downplay them as simple imitations of established characters is to downplay their value. They should be appreciated for who they really are, cool-ass characters that bring more to the already vast dynamics of any given fighting game. Unless it's Kuma Panda, that shit can fuck off.